Here's something that I see very often, especially because so many of the women and people that I work with are super smart. Someone becomes aware of the loop. They recognize the pattern. They understand that restriction leads to binging. The binging leads to, a feeling of shame, and that shame fuels the dysmorphia. They might even recognize that social media is making it worse. And they think, okay, now that I know this, I can stop it. But awareness alone does not break a loop. Hello and welcome back to another new episode of Emotional Eating Unwrapped. I'm your host, Alana Kessler, and I have to say I am actually really excited about this episode. I was excited about it, but then I found this article and I'm even more excited about it now. And it is a topic that I get a lot of questions about. We're going to be talking about the invisible loop between body dysmorphia, disordered eating, and binging. And I get a lot of questions about this. I have gotten a lot of questions about this in my coaching and a one-on-one coaching and the group coaching. If you have a question about this after listening, don't forget that we do our Q&As once every month or so. And there is a link called SpeakPipe where you can drop us an anonymous question and we can use it for our next Q&A. So because this is an episode designed around questions that I have gotten, I anticipate you might have one. So please feel free. Anyway, moving on, I am calling this episode The Loop, particularly because that is exactly what it is. This is not a linear situation. It's not like one of these things causes the other in a straight line. In fact, it absolutely is more circular. Each piece feeds into the next. And unless you really understand how they are connected, you truly can end up stuck in this cycle where you're trying to fix one piece without realizing that you're actually reinforcing the whole system. Before I go deeper into it, I do want to address, the article that I did find that I ended up reworking this whole episode once I found this article. But there's a case going on right now. There's a case going to trial right now. A 20-year-old woman identified as KGM is suing Meta and YouTube for social media addiction. I don't know if you've heard about this, but it is pretty epic. And she's alleging that the addictive design of these platforms, things like infinite scrolling and algorithmic recommendations, these things hooked her before she was even 10 years old. And one of the outcomes that she's citing that happened to her is body dysmorphia. And she says it was body dysmorphia. And then she also cites that she feels like she is suffering from depression, from self-harm. And, she feels like she's had some eating disorders, or at least disordered ways of relating to food as well. And actually, this is the first of 22 bellwether cases being heard in the Los Angeles Superior Court. Snapchat and TikTok have already settled. They've already been in cases, but Meta and Google are fighting it. And I bring this up because I think it's really important to acknowledge that the loop we're talking about today that I was already going to talk about, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. And this is such a perfect example, such a really potent thing that's happening in our society. And it's really important to realize that this is not just an individual problem. It's a systemic problem. The environments we're in, especially the digital environments that we're in, are actively feeding this cycle. And for a lot of young women, the loop starts, long before we might even know, long before we understand or they understand what's happening. So let's talk about what the loop actually is and how it works and what it takes to break it, because that is what we're going to be talking about today. But before we begin, I want to introduce you to me. If you are new to me, my name is Alana Kessler. I am a registered functional dietitian. I have been in this health, this wellness space, mindfulness space for over 2 decades. And I've worked clinically. I've worked in my own private practice. I owned a yoga studio for almost 10 years, where I did a lot of mindfulness and somatic work, teaching yoga and etc. I've done all the things, but for the last decade or so, my passion has really been helping people fall in love with their body, lose weight if that's your goal, reconnect with yourself, overcome any kind of emotional or addictive pattern, behaviors with food, and really just let yourself rise up to live your best life and just remove anything that takes away from you being your best self. So if you are new here, welcome. If you are a longer time listener, welcome back, and let's dive in. Okay, so let's start with some clarity because these terms get thrown around a lot and they don't always mean what people think they mean. So we're going to talk about body dysmorphia. So what is body dysmorphia? Body dysmorphia is a distorted perception of your body. And it's not just disliking it, okay? It's not just disliking how you look. It's a genuine disconnect between what your body actually looks like and what you perceive when you look in the mirror and you think about your body. Okay, so what it actually looks like and what you perceive that your body looks like. And people with body dysmorphia, they often fixate on specific areas. They might see themselves as much larger than they are, or they might obsess over a few perceived flaws that other people don't even notice. And it's not something you can logic your way out of for the most part, right? It's not about getting more compliments or more validation or losing more weight. The distortion is actually happening on a perceptual level. Okay. So let's talk now about disordered eating. Okay. Disordered eating is a broad term. Okay. It includes behaviors like restricting, skipping meals, rigid food rules, obsessive calorie counting, eating only quote unquote safe foods, using food and eating as a way to control something when everything else feels out of control. It's not typically diagnosable or always diagnosable as an eating disorder, but it's also not normal, healthy eating. It's eating that's driven by fear, by control, and a disconnection from your body's actual needs, actually. Okay. And then we're going to talk about binging. So binging is, it's eating a large amount of food. Okay. So binging is eating a large amount of food in a relatively short period of time, often with a sense of losing control. It is not the same as overeating. Overeating might happen at Thanksgiving, at a celebratory dinner, even at a random time, but binging feels compulsive. It feels urgent. And oftentimes it comes with sort of like a blackout and a feeling of shame and a dissociation, in fact. And here's the key. Binging is usually and typically not about food at all. It's not about food. It's not about the actual food itself. That's what I mean. It's about what the food is doing for you in that moment, whether that's numbing, soothing, distracting, giving you a break from something you don't want to feel. Okay. So those are the three pieces: body dysmorphia, disordered eating, and binging. Now we're going to talk about how they connect. Okay. So the loop could start at any point, but increasingly, and what I've noticed in the people that I work with and just in general, the way people talk about their body, their food, and their eating habits is that it's starting earlier and earlier. And it's not happening in isolation. It's happening in an environment that's specifically designed to distort your perception of yourself and keep you engaged, often at the expense of your mental health. Okay, so let's go back to this lawsuit for a second. KGM started using these platforms before the age of 10. And what she's saying is that the design, the endless scroll, the curated feeds, the algorithmically served content created an addiction, created the behavior of addiction. But it wasn't just an addiction to the platform. It was addiction to comparison, to validation, to a version of beauty and acceptability that's really narrow, that's filtered and completely unattainable. And when you're exposed to that repeatedly, especially during vulnerable ages, developmentally vulnerable years, it shapes how you see yourself. You start to internalize the message that your body is not acceptable as it is. And you see these edited images, these filtered faces, curated bodies, and your brain starts to see those as the standard. And then when you look at your own body, it doesn't measure up. And of course it doesn't measure up because the standard isn't real. The standard is not real. Your brain is taking this in and your brain doesn't know that that's not real. So it registers this gap as a problem. And once your body becomes the problem, the solution becomes obvious, which is change your body. right? So this gap between your body and what you're seeing, which is an unrealistic standard, makes this comparison gap. And the solution that a lot of us come to is change your body. So you start restricting, you start dieting, you start eating less, cutting out foods, following rules. And at first it might feel good, right? It might feel like control. It might feel like taking your life into your own hands. It might feel like progress, like you're finally, doing something. But here's what happens. When you restrict, your body interprets that as a threat. It's just, we've talked about this before in other episodes. Your body does not process restriction as something that's good for it. Physiologically, from a survival reptilian place, it's going to see it as a threat. It doesn't know you're dieting. It just knows you're not getting enough food. It ramps up hunger signals. It increases that energy of craving. And also what it does is it slows your metabolism, right? Because it's conserving. It's in conservation mode. And it creates this neurobiological feedback loop where food becomes like rewarding. Food becomes rewarding. And at the same time, restriction creates this psychological deprivation. So you're not just physically hungry, you're mentally obsessed with the foods that you're not allowing yourself to have, right? You're thinking about food constantly, right? This is a version of food noise. You're thinking of food constantly. You're planning, you're avoiding, you're feeling the craving, but you're kind of just like, you're like resolute. You're like, it's like white knuckling your way through it. And eventually that stops working, right? Eventually the dam breaks and you can't sustain that anymore. No one can. So the binge happens. Okay. The binge happens. And the binge is not random. It is a direct physiological and psychological response to the restriction that came before it. Okay. Your body's trying to survive. Your brain is trying to get relief, and food, especially the foods that you've been restricting. So when the binge happens, it's typically foods we've been restricting, the ones that we've deemed as bad. That's what we eat. And when you eat it in this state of mind, this state of being, it delivers both the surviving and the relief. Okay. So now we're in this place where we binge, right? So you binge, and immediately afterwards, what happens? There's the regret, there's the shame, there's the guilt, there's the self-flagellation, the self-loathing. You feel more out of control. You feel maybe like you failed. You're kind of just really disgusted with yourself. And what do you do with those feelings? What do you do with those feelings? You look in the mirror, and now the body dysmorphia gets worse, because now you're not just seeing a body that you don't like with the perception gap. You're seeing a body that you believe you just made even worse by binging, and you feel bigger. You feel bloated. You feel like the binge confirmed everything that you were afraid of. There's now evidence to this feeling a little bit because of what just happened. And so the distortion deepens. You think, oh my God, I need to fix this immediately. I need to get back on track. I need to be stricter. So what do? You restrict again. And so maybe you go back to scrolling. Maybe you're looking for motivation. Maybe you're looking for inspiration. Online, you're looking for something else, like another diet, another plan, the next quick fix, right? And you kind of put it on yourself that if you finally just do the right thing, find the right thing, follow the right influencer, it'll all work out. Like you'll finally be acceptable. And the thing is, the algorithm is going to serve you exactly what you're looking for. More content about aggressive weight loss strategies that are completely unhealthy, more before and afters, more what I eat in a day videos, more like subtle and not so subtle messages that your body is a problem and is a project and it needs to be fixed. And the loop tightens, right? The loop tightens over and over, right? There's the restriction, the micromanaging, the over controlling, then the not being able to do it anymore. So the binge happens, the shame part of it, the distorted perception, body dysmorphia, scroll online to, find solutions, get quote unquote motivation, and then rinse and repeat, restrict again. And here's the thing, every time that you go through this loop, it reinforces itself. It reinforces itself because the restricting makes the binging much more likely. The binging makes the regret and just the self-loathing so much more intense. And the self-loathing and then just the feeling of shame makes the body dysmorphia even more distorted. And the distortion makes the restriction and the, once again, micromanaging even more necessary. And the platform keeps feeding you content that validates the whole thing. It becomes a self-perpetuating system. And unless you interrupt it, it just keeps going. And so one of the reasons that this loop is so insidious is that it's invisible to most people. From the outside, it might just look like you're someone who's trying to be healthy or watching what they eat. But from the inside, you know that it's so much more mentally, emotionally, and physically chaotic. It's so much more chaotic than it seems. And you might be listening to this and you might not even be seeing the full picture. Sometimes the person living in this loop is seeing the full picture because each piece a lot of times feels separate, right? You think I have a problem with my body. That's one thing. I have a problem with binging. That's another thing. I need to eat better. That's the third thing. I spend too much time on social media. That's a fourth thing. And you don't realize that these are not actually four separate problems. They're four parts of the same system. And you can't solve one without addressing the other. You can't stop binging if you're still restricting. You can't stop restricting if you still believe your body's unacceptable. And you can't shift your perception of your body if you're stuck in a shame spiral after every time that a binge happens. And you can't do any of that if you're constantly consuming content that reinforces the distortion, right? They're all in lockstep together. And most traditional approaches don't account for this whole ecosystem. Traditional weight loss diet measures, they give you a diet, they focus on calories, points, macros, whatever. It's driven by metrics. Binge eating treatment often focuses on the behavior without addressing the restriction or the dysmorphia. And body image work often skips over eating patterns entirely and also sometimes even overlooks people's desires to live in a different type of body, which might be completely valid. And almost no one is talking about the role that social media plays in being basically the engine of this whole cycle on some level. So people end up working on one piece of it in isolation and wondering why nothing actually changes. And before we go forward, I just want to remind you that if you are a longtime listener or even a new listener, it helps so much to get the word out about our podcast and just share the podcast with more people that are struggling in isolation when you give our podcast 5 stars and you leave us a written review telling us what you have benefited most out of the podcast. And it just helps us so much when you subscribe, you leave us the 5-star rating and review, and even on YouTube. If you are a podcast watcher like myself, please give us a subscribe there. We've looked at the data and actually 58% of you who watch our podcast on YouTube are not subscribers. So just click that subscribe button. So easy, and become a subscriber and help us grow our channel there as well. Thank you so much in advance. I want to talk about control for a minute because it is really central to this whole loop. For a lot of people, the disordered eating starts as an attempt to control something. And it's not always food. A lot of times it's life feels uncertain, emotions feel overwhelming, your body feels like it's unpredictable, it's changing, it's uncomfortable, maybe it's unsafe, right? Your body just, you don't feel safe in your body. There's been trauma that has happened, and food becomes the thing that you actually can control because you can control what you eat, when you eat, how much you eat. And at first that could feel really empowering. But there's a paradox with this, because the more that you try to control your eating, oftentimes the more out of control it becomes, especially if it's coming from this motivation. Because when you control, especially with restriction, again, like I said, it creates this pressure, and the pressure eventually wants to release, and then the binge happens, and then you feel completely out of control. After a binge, the opposite thing that you feel is control. And feeling out of control when you deeply, deeply desire control is really, really terrifying. And so what I want you to hear is, when you have a binge, that might be still happening for you. If you have a binge, it's not evidence that you lack control. In fact, it might be evidence that you're potentially over controlling, and it's actually your body's attempt. It's likely that regulating in a less all or nothing way is not something that you've developed yet. And so this is your body's attempt to restore balance. The goal and the work is really to learn to trust your body again, instead of trying to, manage it. But we're talking about this loop here that's really hard to do when you're also dealing with body dysmorphia. Okay. This is why this episode is about the systemic nature of these things. Because if you don't trust what you see when you look in the mirror, how are you supposed to trust your body with food? How are you supposed to let go? And if the content you're consuming every day is telling you that your body's not acceptable, how are you supposed to believe anything different, really? You've built a good life. From the outside, it looks like you have it all together. You eat clean, you work hard, you take care of everyone. But there's this one area that still feels impossible to master, and that is food. You can eat perfectly all day and still end up in the kitchen at night wondering why you keep doing this. You promise yourself you'll start fresh tomorrow, and I know you mean it every single time. But the cycle, it always finds its way back, especially when you're stressed, when you're overwhelmed, or when you're just tired of being the one that's holding it all together. And I get it, because I lived that way for years. And what I learned is this. The problem, it was never about food. It was the pressure underneath it, the perfectionism, the self-doubt, the part of me that never felt safe and secure to just be me. And that's why I created the sober eating sequence. It's a proven 3-phase method that rewires the emotional patterns and the belief systems driving overeating, so you can relax, trust yourself around food, and release weight completely naturally, without force and without obsession. Because when your body feels secure, it lets go. The cravings quiet, the self-punishment, it softens, and food, it stops being the thing that you have to fix. This is not another plan. This isn't another rule book. It's a revolutionary transformation for your nervous system, for your body, and for your identity. So join the sober eating movement today. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about the body dysmorphia piece, because you might not have heard this before. Like I said, body dysmorphia is not just, I wish I looked different. It's a perceptual distortion. It's your brain literally showing you something that doesn't match reality. And when you're living with that distortion, every decision that you make about food and about eating is filtered through the false image. You look in the mirror and you see someone who needs to lose a lot of weight, even if you're at a healthy weight. Some people I know that struggle with body dysmorphia, I mean, myself, I was one of them. And honestly, I still sometimes catch myself having to tell myself, like, okay, you're just, at this time of the month. And like, if you don't like what you're seeing in the mirror, this too shall pass, right? Like, that's something that I still have to coach myself about. But there are people that are underweight that still struggle with body dysmorphia. So this doesn't really have anything to do with weight. It's just that if your image of yourself is distorted, nothing you do ever feels like it's enough. Even if you do lose weight, right? Like I said, it's not about weight. You'll still see the same thing in the mirror, right? You hit your goal weight, the goalpost keeps moving perceptually. You'll get compliments, but they don't really land because what people are seeing and saying to you and what you're seeing and feeling are two completely different things. And body dysmorphia makes you believe that the over control and the dieting and the restricting and the toxic behavior with food, the over control micromanaging with food is necessary and justified. And that eventually you'll get to a place where it'll be good, but that day never comes. And I think this is obvious, but the problem isn't your body. It's the lens. It's the lens that you're looking through. And no amount of weight loss or control with food is going to fix a perceptual distortion. And here's where the social media part comes in, especially if that distortion is constantly being forced with the images and videos and reels that you see online. And this is what KGM is arguing in her lawsuit, that the platforms didn't just expose her to harmful content. They were designed to keep her engaged with it, to serve her more of it, to make it harder and harder for her to look away. And when you're young, and even, you don't even have to be young, right? I mean, I feel like there are people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, like it's just, age isn't even really a part of it, but especially when you're young, because your brain is still forming and your sense of self is still forming, that kind of exposure, it doesn't just influence you, it shapes you because it actually shapes the way that your brain becomes, right? This is the neurobiology of it all. Now, obviously we know about neuroplasticity. I'm not going to go into that today. And that's a lot of the work that I do in my programs involves neuroplasticity so that we can reprogram things that have created toxic pathways in our neurology and in our psychology and essentially in our behavior and physiology. But we're not going to go deeper into that. But ultimately, it does become a huge foundation of how you see yourself. And breaking free from that isn't just about individual willpower. It's about recognizing that you have been operating in a system that was designed to make you feel inadequate. Okay. And so now we're going to add on the emotional layer because the loop isn't just physical and perceptual. It's very emotional. A lot of people who struggle with this loop are also dealing with anxiety, depression, like I said before, trauma, perfectionism, low self-worth, a need for control in the face of uncertainty, maybe avoidance, right? And food becomes a way to manage all that, to kind of give yourself a sense of safety, because restriction can feel like discipline. It can feel like productivity. It could feel like you're doing something. And binging can feel like a relief, a break from pressure. You can even get pleasure from it for like 5 minutes in the beginning, And what happens is like the self-punishment or the shame afterwards, it feels familiar. It confirms the story that you already believe about yourself, that you're not good enough, you can't be trusted, that you're fundamentally flawed, right? This is the belief system, the deep rootedness of it. So the loop isn't just behavioral, it's emotional. And unless you address the emotional drivers, the underlying anxiety, the perfectionism, the self-worth and self-value issues, the loop will keep running. This is one of the major, like the exact step-by-step process to rewire the self-value and the self-worth in the Invisible Weight Detox that I have, the introduction to the sober eating sequence. So definitely go check that out because it really does lay out how you can very easily rewire the emotional piece of this so your behaviors can change. And you can really reimagine and just like reprogram the way that you relate to yourself and therefore you relate to your behaviors with food. So the next part I want to talk about is why awareness alone isn't enough. Because here's something that I see very often, especially because so many of the women and people that I work with are super smart. Someone becomes aware of the loop. They recognize the pattern. They understand that restriction leads to binging. The binging leads to a feeling of shame, and that shame fuels the dysmorphia. They might even recognize that social media is making it worse. And they think, okay, now that I know this, I can stop it. But awareness alone does not break the loop because the loop is not cognitive. It's not just a cognitive loop. It's neurological. It's physiological. It's emotional. It's environmental. Your brain has learned this pattern. Your body has adapted to it, and your nervous system has wired itself around it. And the platforms that you're actively on, your social media platforms, are reinforcing it every single day. So even when you know better, you still do the same thing, right? You still restrict because it feels safe. You still binge because the pressure builds, right? You still spiral into shame because that's the path, the well-worn path that you know, and you still scroll because it's habitual, because it's also soothing, and because you don't know what else to do. So breaking the loop requires more than awareness. It requires intervention. It requires intervention on multiple levels. You have to address the restriction. You have to address, the micromanaging of food by learning how to eat in a way that's actually nourishing and responsive. You have to address the binging, not by like cold turkey stopping to binge, but by understanding what it's trying to give you and finding other ways to meet that need. And you have to address the body dysmorphia, not by trying to love your body overnight, right? Not this false body positivity, but by learning to separate perception from reality and building a more compassionate, neutral relationship with what you see, right? More sober relationship with what you see, right? That's what I was saying before, something that I've cultivated with myself. Like, even if I'm getting the messaging and the voices that are telling me these things, I'm sober around it. I don't really react. Okay. And you have to address the emotional drivers as well. The anxiety, the perfectionism, the need for wanting to control so that food stops being that primary tool you use to regulate your internal world. But here's also an important part of it. You have to address your environment. You can do all the internal work in the world. You could do all the things I just said, everything that you can do with your relationship with yourself and with food. But if you're still consuming content that tells you that your body is the problem, you are working against yourself. It's like trying to, recover from alcohol addiction while spending every evening in a bar, right? The environment matters. And right now, for a lot of people, especially women, actually, I don't know if that's so true. I feel like men struggle with this too. But for a lot of people, and I do think it is younger people that are struggling with this more, but the environment's toxic. And not just because of individual pieces of content, but because of how the platforms are inherently designed. They're designed to show you more of what you engage with, regardless of whether you've engaged with it from a skillful, well-intentioned place. So if you've ever clicked on a weight loss post, a before and after photo, what I eat in a day video, the algorithm will learn that and it starts serving you more, right? It's exactly what I was saying before about the reviews. And, this is in the other direction, right? The more you engage, we actually are in control of what we end up putting out in the world and receiving in the world, right? So if you're clicking on this stuff, you're going to get more of this stuff, right? You don't even have to seek it out. It just appears. And every time you see it, it reinforces the message subconsciously that your body isn't good enough, right? You need to change. You need to fix yourself. And that makes breaking the loop harder because you're not just fighting your own thoughts, your own unconscious patterns. You're fighting a system that profits off of your own insecurity. Okay. So I just want to take a minute and just reinforce again why I'm so passionate about it, because, it's easy to look at this or hear this and be like, well, people just need to put their phones away. Like, why are it such a blame game? Like, people just need to put their phones away, but that completely misses the point. These platforms are engineered by some of the smartest minds in the world using behavioral psychology, neuroscience, specifically to make them hard to put down. The infinite scroll thing was not an accident, right? It was designed to eliminate stopping cues. It was designed to override our own internal cues, right? Algorithmic feeds, they weren't an accident. They were designed to show you content that triggers emotional responses because emotion drives engagement. Notifications, likes, comments, all of it's designed to create this dopamine, these dopamine hits that keep you coming back. And especially when you're a child, when you're a kid and, your prefrontal cortex isn't developed yet, when your sense of self is still forming, you don't have the cognitive tools to really resist, just kind of going, right? So this isn't like a weakness. This isn't anything to do with discipline. You're just up against a system that was built to override your ability to disengage with it. And when that system is also serving you content that further distorts your perception of your body, glorifies diet culture and aggressive weight loss methods, that, normalizes disordered eating in this kind of like insidious way, it's not just addictive, it's actually harmful. And KGM's case is alleging exactly that. Meta and YouTube, they know that their platforms were addictive. They knew they were harmful to young users and that they designed them that way anyway, because engagement equals profit. And if the cost of that profit is a generation of young women struggling with body dysmorphia, eating disorders, depression, and self-harm, well, that's been treated as an acceptable externality until now, because now it's being challenged in court. And whether or not this case succeeds, it is shining a light on something that's been happening in the shadows for a really long time. The loop between body dysmorphia, disordered eating, and binging, it is not an individual problem. Like I said before, it's a systemic one. And we can't solve it only by focusing on individual change, though that is very important to do. The bottom line is we're not going to be able to remove this entirely. I do think that there has to be restrictions for children for sure, but we're not going to be able to get away from this social media culture forever. And to be honest, look, I think it has its benefits, right? I wouldn't be able to help as many people as I do without social media, without YouTube, without podcasts and things that the algorithm do share with people. So there is positives to it, but there have to be some regulations. And I do think that social media does have an impact on it, and it is something that we really have to take seriously. So what does it actually look like to interrupt the loop? The first thing is to break the over-controlling of food, break the desire for rules, for following metrics, for this kind of external structure that weight loss plans and diet plans give you. And I know that can sound scary to some people. It could sound counterintuitive, but you really cannot stop binging if you're still restricting, right? It's like you can't have light without dark. You can't have the sun without the moon. You can't stop binging if you're still restricting. So you have to start eating consistently without rules. You have to eat enough without compensation, and you have to build that trust internally, right? Through feedback, through process. You have to give your body permission to trust that food is available, that it's not going to be deprived again tomorrow, so that your metabolism can optimize. And that will definitely feel uncomfortable at first. Okay. You might feel out of control. You might eat more than you think you should. You might feel like you actually are gaining a little bit of weight. That's sometimes part of the process, right? Your body is recalibrating. It's learning that it's safe. It's learning that it's safe. And once it feels safe, it lets go of extra. Okay. That is a fact. It happened to me. That happens to all my clients. And at the same time, you have to start challenging the body dysmorphia, right? And it doesn't mean forcing yourself to love what you see in the mirror. It just means recognizing that what you see might not be accurate. It means getting curious about the distortion instead of believing it carte blanche, instead of taking it as fact. It means seeking external feedback, not for validation, but just to test your reality. And you have to start addressing the emotional piece. You have to start building other tools for regulation, other ways to feel safe, soothed, and in control than your dynamic with eating and with food. So whatever that is for you is something that you have to develop. A lot of people always say to me well, tell me what to do. And I hesitate because everybody has their own thing. You don't want to be following someone else's regulation strategy, right? You want to look within yourself and be like, what do I like, right? And then there's the environmental piece. You have to audit your social media consumption, right? Audit is the key word here. I'm not saying completely hate on it, but audit it, right? What are you following? What are you consuming? How do you feel after you're scrolling? If you feel good after you're scrolling, I'm not one of these people that thinks that, scrolling is a problem. It's just if you can ask yourself the question, how do I feel after I'm scrolling and it's bad? That's the problem. If you're following your accounts that make you feel worse about your body, unfollow them, or say things that make you question your worth, unfollow them. If you're consuming content that glorifies aggressive weight loss methods, restriction, or promotes unrealistic standards, stop. Even if you're like following it and you have this mindset of just like, oh my God, this is so bad. What's weird is like you're saying that consciously, but like subconsciously, something is still registering because you're giving it your attention. So you have to stop. If you're spending hours a day on a platform that triggers comparison and anxiety, you got to set limits with that. Delete apps if you need to, turn off notifications, curate your feed intentionally so that what you see reflects the values that you actually want to live by, not the insecurities that the algorithm is trying to exploit. Okay. This isn't about being perfect. Like I said, it's about being intentional, because you can't heal in the same environment that made you sick or that made you feel bad in the first place. And if your digital environment that counts is constantly reinforcing this loop, then you have to change it. But before we close, I just want to acknowledge something that is really important, that the loop doesn't affect everyone equally, right? Some people can scroll through Instagram, see edited images and, not internalize. Some people can follow a more structured eating style without it turning into disordered eating. Some people can have a complicated relationship with food without it becoming a full-blown cycle, right? A full-blown disordered eating pattern. And so what is the difference? There's a few things. The first one is developmental timing. And this is where we started with KGM, right? If you were exposed to this content during critical developmental windows of your life, puberty, adolescence, early adulthood, it has a bigger impact. Absolutely. Your brain is more plastic. Like I said earlier, your sense of belief is much more malleable. You're much more vulnerable to external messages about who you should be, right? KGM started using these platforms before age 10. That's not a coincidence at all. The younger you are when the one part of the loop starts, the deeper it gets wired. Okay. The second is pre-existing vulnerabilities, right? If you already struggle with anxiety, perfectionism, low self-worth, depression, trauma, something like that, you're more susceptible because part of the loop offers you something that you're already looking for, which is a sense of control, a distraction from difficult feelings, a way to feel like you're doing something for yourself, that you're doing something right. The third is a social and cultural context. So if you're in an environment where thinness is valued, I've talked about this before on other episodes as well, where thinness is valued, where appearance is tied to worth, to the validation that you get from the people around you, or where you're in an environment where women's bodies are constantly scrutinized, the loop gets reinforced there as well. So it's not just what you see on your phone. It's what you hear from your family, your peers, maybe even your partner, right? Your culture, all of that adds on. And the fourth is access to support. If you have access to education, to people that can help you, reality tests, to my programs, they're all designed to break this pattern and reestablish that internal sovereignty and that healthy relationship with yourself and eating, right? If you have access to this, you have a much better chance of breaking the loop. And if you don't, right, if you're isolated, if you don't have resources, if you don't have language for what you're experiencing, the loop can run unchecked for years, which is why I'm so passionate about this podcast, because I know that for people that maybe don't have the means for support, whether it's therapy, my programs, other types of support like that requires financial means, this podcast, free podcast like this can be so helpful. And so, this whole thing, it's a complex interaction between biology, psychology, development, environment, and, systemic design, our cultural systemic design. And some people are more vulnerable than other people. And that's the truth, But, here's the thing, breaking the loop, breaking the loop, it takes time, right? It's not a quick fix. It's not a 30-day challenge. It's not something you can really hack or optimize your way out of, right? It's a process of unlearning and relearning, integrating, unlearning, relearning, integrating, evolving, kind of just unlearning the belief that your body is the problem, unlearning the idea that restriction equals a better outcome for you, that you're going to be more in control when you restrict, and unlearning this internalized shame that's been driving the whole cycle, right? And of course, like unlearning that you actually have to look a certain way to be acceptable. You absolutely are acceptable beautiful just as you are. However, we all deserve to look and feel how we desire to, especially if it comes from a place of self-worth and an intentional place. We want to relearn how to eat in a way that's connected, that's responsive. And we want to relearn how to see our bodies with more, reality, more accuracy, less judgment. And we want to be able to learn how to feel the full breadth of our feelings, have more capacity for feelings without needing food to help us manage them. And we want to learn how to engage with social media that doesn't erode our sense of self. In that process, it's definitely not linear. There's good days, there's hard days when you feel like you're making progress, and days where you absolutely are going to feel like you're back at square one. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be consistent. And over time, the loop will absolutely lose its grip. That's about it. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for listening to this one. I hope if you made it through to the entire episode, I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, if you have any questions, you can leave us a voice note on SpeakPipe. And if you're interested in more from me, I do offer a free weekly newsletter that goes out every Sunday called the Sunday Newsletter. You could sign up for that on the website, www.bewellbyak.com. And until next time, I'm Alana, and thank you for listening to Emotional Eating Unwrapped.